Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we have another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 73rd deck and it's titled Fiery Superfriends. And if you haven't seen the show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So really quickly, before we get into the actual deck tech itself, I do want to take a second to highlight some of our social media accounts, some of the ways you can reach out to us, and some of the ways that you can help support the channel as well. So if you'd like to follow us over on Twitter, it's at 13POYNZ. Reddit is u/POYNZ13. Email dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. All of these are great ways to reach out to us. I'm more than happy to answer any questions, talk to the community, let people know what's going on, and I do try my best to post updates on the videos and everything else that's happening with the channel, so if you're looking for some updates, those are some great places to check out. Otherwise, if you're looking to support the channel a little bit more directly, you can head on over to TCG Player and we use our affiliate link that is in the description of the video down below. And any cards you purchase from them, we get a little bit of a kickback from, just as a thank you for sending you their way. So that is one way you can support us. And the other and most direct way is at patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, where you can give us a little bit every month, and in return you get access to a Discord where you can help participate in building some of the decks, in filming some of the games for the channel. You can help out by getting the deck lists a week early, giving some feedback on that. You can suggest cards with the 100% guarantee that they will be turned into decks at some point for this channel. And of course, at the very top, you also get access to the unedited gameplay videos, so you can hear the players' commentary over the game rather than just myself. And you also get one of our random cards every single month sent directly to you as a thank you for all of your support. And so I do have to give a shout out to our 4 current patrons. We have William Swiftfoot, we have Doodle, we have Observer Will, and Calvin Schmidt. So to the 4 of you, thank you very much. And if none of this is something that you're interested in doing, or if it's just not quite your style, you can, of course, always just like the video, subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit. So thank you very much to everyone's support. But I suppose without any further ado, let's jump into our actual deck tech. So our random card for this week was suggested by a good friend of mine, Mike. He goes by McKG3 on Twitter and on Twitch. So if you're interested in checking out some of his content, he makes phenomenal videos. He is starting to work on some Magic content as well, making some proxies with some of the art for his comic book. So, great guy. If you're interested or have the time, please do check him out. And he has also played in some games on this channel before as well, so you may have seen him around before. But the card that he asked us to build around this week is Chandra, Fire of Kaladesh, which is 1 red for a 2/2 legendary creature, human shaman. Whenever you cast a red spell, untap Chandra, Fire of Kaladesh, and you can tap and Chandra, Fire of Kaladesh deals 1 damage to target player. If Chandra has dealt 3 or more damage this turn, exile her, then return her to the battlefield transformed under her owner's control. And when she transforms, she turns into Chandra Roaring Flame, which is a 4 loyalty Planeswalker Chandra. +1, Chandra Roaring Flame deals 2 damage to target player. -2, Chandra Roaring Flame deals 2 damage to target creature, or -7, Chandra Roaring Flame deals 6 damage to each opponent, and each player dealt damage this way gets an emblem with, at the beginning of your upkeep, this emblem deals 3 damage to you. So, since our random card of the week is a legendary creature, that does mean that she is also going to be our commander, which is a little bit unique. We do get to have a Planeswalker in the command zone, which is pretty different than most styles of deck. But when this deck idea first came in, I was a little confused on how to build the deck. A lot of the Chandra Fire of Kaladesh decks I've seen before have been Chandra tribal decks, so they want to play every Chandra that exists, they want to play all the Chandra related cards, or they've been kind of a spell slinger deck and they want to just kind of burn out their opponents and do a ton of damage. I wanted to try to do something a little bit different, but still kind of in the same vein, because that is what Chandra's good at. So, let's talk about some of our themes, and I'll kind of explain where some of the ideas for this deck came from. Now, the first part of this is because we have a Planeswalker in the command zone, we do still care about Planeswalkers. I did want to make sure that our entire focus wasn't just on Chandra Planeswalkers, but we do have a ton of red, essentially super friends for this deck, hence the name of the video. And so, as a good example of that, we have Chandra, Acolyte of Flame, which is 1 red for a 4 loyalty legendary planeswalker, Chandra. You can 0 her to put a loyalty counter on each red planeswalker you control, so that's the Super Friends aspect right there. You can also 0 her to create 2 1/1 red elemental creature tokens. They gain haste, sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step, and -2, you may cast target instant or sorcery card with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard. If that card would be put into your graveyard this turn, exile it instead. So Chandra is a great Super Friends card because she's going to put loyalty counters on all of our other planeswalkers. And I did try to make sure that we didn't really include any colorless planeswalkers too much. I know that cards like Karn and Ugin are very powerful. They do also tend to be a little bit more on the expensive side, and since this is a budget deck, it does make sense that we're leaning more into the red planeswalkers who are not quite as expensive. I mean, Chandra here is only 86 cents, so we're able to include a lot more planeswalkers if we kind of exclude some of the colorless ones. But that does lead us to our next theme, and I know I said that I tried to lean away from the Chandra Tribal. However, we do still have some cards that care about Chandra Planeswalkers. Most of the red Planeswalkers you're going to find are going to be Chandra Planeswalkers, and it would be nice to have cards that care about, your Koth Planeswalkers, or your Rowan Planeswalkers, or your Jayas, or your Sarkhans, but most of them really care about Chandra. So we do have a couple of cards like Carol Keep Disciples, which is 2 red for a 4/3 human monk, that says whenever you activate a loyalty ability of a Chandra Planeswalker, Carol Keep Disciples deals 1 damage to each opponent. So there's not a ton of very useful quote-unquote Chandra cards that aren't Planeswalkers, but Carol Keep Disciples is a good one. Because about half of our Planeswalkers are Chandras, it makes sense that we want to be able to do damage whenever we're activating our Chandra's abilities. And since our commander is actually a Chandra, this is never a dead card, because we at least always have access to 1 Chandra Planeswalker no matter what. And the key part about Carol Keep Disciples is that it does 1 damage to each opponent. It's not just 1, so by just activating a Chandra Planeswalker, we are able to do 3 damage total divided around the table, which is incredibly powerful, especially if we have multiple Chandras that we can activate each turn. So Carol Keep Disciples, a bit weird, especially because I know I said we're leaning away from Chandra Tribal, but since most red planeswalkers are Chandras anyway, it made sense to at least include a little bit of that. And then finally, we get to the last theme, which is pretty unique for this deck. We want to protect our planeswalkers, and I figured the best way to protect our planeswalkers was actually to play defenders. So we have a defender theme in this deck. Most of our creatures, in fact, I think almost all of our creatures, there's only a couple, Carol Keep Disciples being one of them, that don't have defender. So Vent Sentinel is a great example of this, and honestly one of our big payoffs for being a defender sub-theme in mono red, because Vent Sentinel is 3 and a red for a 2/4 creature elemental, has defender, so it can't attack, but you can pay 1 in a red and tap, and Vent Sentinel deals damage to target player equal to the number of creatures with defender you control. So even if we control no other creatures with defender, this can do 1 damage each turn. But if we have 5, 6, 7 defenders on board to protect our planeswalkers, we can at the very least use Vent Sentinel every turn to do that 5, 6, or 7 damage to an opponent. Meaning that we can kind of transition from defending into a bit of a burn deck as long as we have Vent Sentinel, and then most of our planeswalkers also do damage to our opponents, so we can kind of stall out the game and hope to try to value our way out. It is also important to note that there's not a ton of things in red that have reach, but there are a weird number of defenders in red that have reach, so we do have some solid protection from planeswalkers, even just playing our normal game plan, which is kind of a neat aspect to this. But that's enough of our themes for this week. So the next piece of this deck tech is, of course, to check out some key cards. Some of the cards that we would love to have in play if possible, and really help accelerate us to our game plan and eventually, hopefully, winning us the game. So first up, we have Chandra's Regulator. And I know I put 2 Chandra cards in here when I talked about not being Chandra tribal, but Chandra's Regulator is great in honestly any mono red deck, because Chandra's Regulator is 1 in a red for a legendary artifact. Whenever you activate a loyalty ability of a Chandra Planeswalker, you may pay 1. If you do, copy that ability. You may choose new targets for the copy. Straight up, that is very good. We want to make sure that we can copy all of our Chandra's abilities. Phenomenal. But the real reason that this is a key card is for the second ability, which says you can pay 1, tap, discard a mountain card or a red card, draw a card. There's not a ton of straight up draw a card effects in red. Yeah, it's the looting aspect of it, but because we're able to discard mountains and or red cards, there's not going to be much in our hand that's dead. We can always throw it away to draw a new card if we need to, and that's especially relevant if we start flooding out. Most of the time, we're not able to get rid of the mountains in our hand. We don't want a ton of mountains, so we can kind of pitch away those mountains and draw new cards, and hopefully those new cards will be able to get us closer to winning the game. Yeah, the first half of this is phenomenal, and if you can ultimate a Chandra and also copy that ability, that's pretty much going to win you the game every time, but it's also a great way to loot away cards that we don't want and make sure that we always have something to do in our hand. And so that leads into our second key card, which is going to be Heart of Kiran. And Heart of Kiran isn't a defender, but it's technically not also a creature, so I don't know if it really counts. But it is 2 mana for a 4/4 legendary artifact vehicle. It has flying, vigilance, and crew 3. And admittedly, it is going to be very difficult to crew this with creatures because we don't have a ton of creatures power 3 or greater, but luckily, it also has another line of text that says you may remove a loyalty counter from a planeswalker you control rather than pay Heart of Kiran's crew cost. Since this is a 4/4 flying vigilance, we could attack with it on our turn and then keep it back to defend our planeswalkers, and rather than our opponents hitting our planeswalkers for 2 or 3, we just have to remove 1 loyalty counter from them and activate Heart of Kiran to block. And normally, even just the threat of activation means our opponents aren't going to be attacking into our planeswalkers because they don't want to run into a 4/4 with flying and vigilance. So Heart of Kiran does a great job of defending our walkers, but at the same time, it also does a great job of just preventing anyone from attacking us, meaning that, yeah, we could remove loyalty counters to activate Heart of Kiran, but a lot of times we just don't have to. Heart of Kiran is a great defense mechanism, especially when we have a massive board of defenders and a massive board of planeswalkers. So that is definitely why it earns a slot as a key card in our deck. And finally, our first non-Chandra Planeswalker that we're going to talk about, Sarkhan the Masterless, which is 3 red for a 5 loyalty legendary Planeswalker Sarkhan. It has a passive ability that says whenever a creature attacks you or a Planeswalker you control, each dragon you control deals 1 damage to that creature. Now, unfortunately, we don't have any dragons, so that doesn't do too much. But the real reason that it's here is its +1 ability that says until end of turn, each planeswalker you control becomes a 4/4 red dragon creature and gains flying. So if we have 3 planeswalkers on board, they all become 4/4s, we hit someone for 12 damage, and it becomes pretty much a win condition. And if that's not enough, it also has a -3 ability, and you create a 4/4 red dragon creature token with flying. So we can immediately play Sarkhan -3, make a 4/4 dragon that can help defend some of our planeswalkers, and now whenever our planeswalkers are attacked, that dragon's going to do 1 damage to each creature. So if we're able to protect everything with Sarkhan, make sure that our planeswalkers aren't getting pinged down by little 1/1s, make a dragon, have maybe Heart of Kiran in play, have some 4/4 flyers, and then next turn, when Sarkhan no longer has summoning sickness, we can swing in with him as a 4/4 dragon, and any other planeswalkers we may have as 4/4 dragons. So this can be a great way to close out the game, and just like everything else, adds to the protection on our board. So Sarkhan the Masterless, very much the win condition of this deck, other than burning our opponents out, I suppose. So, very much earns a slot as a key card. But that is the last of our key cards for this deck, and that then brings us into our cool interactions, some cards that work very well together. Now, most of the cards in this deck do synergize well, just for the sense that there's a lot of Planeswalkers, there's a lot of Super Friends style abilities, there's a ton of burn because we're mono red. So it was kind of difficult to narrow it down to just a couple, but the first one I want to highlight is actually between Thermo Alchemist and Torbran, Thane of Redfell. So one of our defenders, Thermo Alchemist, 1 in a red for a creature, human shaman. It's a 0/3 defender. Tap, Thermo Alchemist deals 1 damage to each opponent. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, untap Thermo Alchemist. Now, we do have actually a couple of defenders that do a very similar thing. I think we actually have 4 total defenders that can tap to do a damage to either a specific opponent or all of our opponents at once. So, we want to combine that with Torbran, Thane of Redfell, which is 1 red for a 2/4 legendary creature dwarf noble. If a red source you control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage +2 instead. So essentially, if we combine these two cards, we tap Thermo Alchemist with Torbran on board, it's going to do 1 damage +2 to each opponent, meaning it just straight up does 3 damage to each opponent. That is 9 damage for just tapping a 0/3 defender. That is incredibly powerful and is something that can very quickly win the game, especially if we're able to keep tapping and untapping Thermo Alchemist by casting other instants and sorceries, or just tapping it at our opponent's end step when we have nothing else really to do with it. So Thermo Alchemist and Torbran are phenomenal together, especially if we can combine Torbran with a couple of Thermo Alchemist effects, a couple of different creatures that tap to do 1 damage to multiple opponents, because then we're doing 3, 6, 9 damage to each opponent every single turn, and there's not too much our opponents are going to be able to do at that point to survive that level of damage. So definitely a cool interaction, but let's move on to our second cool interaction, which is going to be between Light Up the Night and Chandra Awakened Inferno. So Light Up the Night is X and a red for a sorcery that says Light Up the Night deals X damage to any target. It deals X +1 damage instead if that target is a creature or planeswalker. And it has flashback for 3 in a red. Remove X loyalty counters from among planeswalkers you control. If you cast this spell this way, X can't be 0. So, Light Up the Night can do a ton of damage to an opponent, to a creature, to a planeswalker, whatever we need it to do. And if we combine that with something like Chandra Awakened Inferno, which is 4 red for a 6 loyalty legendary planeswalker Chandra, this spell can't be countered. +2, each opponent gets an emblem with, at the beginning of your upkeep, this emblem deals 1 damage to you. -3, Chandra Awakened Inferno deals 3 damage to each non-elemental creature, and -X, Chandra Awakened Inferno deals X damage to target creature or planeswalker. If a permanent dealt damage this way would die this turn, exile it instead. So, in this case, we chose Chandra Awakened Inferno for this slot because it is the planeswalker with the most starting loyalty, and in fact, you play it, you +2, it goes straight up to 8 loyalty. So we could, in theory, play Chandra Awakened Inferno, +2, give every opponent an emblem, which is going to be great. That's going to give us inevitability. It's going to kill our opponents eventually. Put Chandra to 8 loyalty, and then flashback Light Up the Night to remove the 8 loyalty counters from Chandra to do 8 damage to anything else, which, considering we had that much mana, means we probably cast Light Up the Night earlier to maybe remove a creature, do some more damage, whatever it might be. So these two combined really add to the burn strategy of this deck because we want to be able to do a ton of damage, so when we first cast Light Up the Night, and then maybe Chandra's not our only planeswalker when we flash it back. Maybe we can remove 10 to 15 loyalty counters from among planeswalkers we control, and yeah, that might kill some of our planeswalkers, but that does mean we're doing 10 to 15 damage to an opponent's face or getting rid of a massive threat that's on board. So this is very versatile and can be used in multiple different ways. And we don't have to remove all the counters from Awakened Inferno. We could +2, then remove 7 counters, keep Chandra alive, hopefully next turn be able to +2 again, and keep going and going and going. So a very good interaction and a very nice way to deal with pretty much any issues that we're having at any stage of the game. And that does lead us to the end of our deck tech. We do have to talk a little bit about the price, since this is a budget show. The total deck price this week came out to $97.49, and a good portion of that, we've seen some expensive cards so far, like Chandra Awakened Inferno was $11, but she's actually not the most expensive card. The most expensive card in here is the Chain Veil, which is about $16.07 right now. So the Chain Veil is 4 mana for a legendary artifact. At the beginning of your end step, if you didn't activate a loyalty ability of a Planeswalker this turn, you lose 2 life. That won't happen too much. Usually we'll always have at least some Planeswalkers on board. And 4 tap. For each Planeswalker you control, you may activate one of its loyalty abilities once this turn, as though none of its loyalty abilities have been activated this turn. So essentially, this lets us activate all of our Planeswalkers twice every single turn, as long as we can pay 4 mana. Which means that with something like Chandra Awakened Inferno, we can +2, activate the Chain Veil, +2 again, meaning that all we've got to do is put Chandra up to 10 loyalty, give each opponent 2 emblems that's doing 2 damage to them every single turn, and there's not much our opponents can do. That's going to kill people eventually, especially if we're allowed to untap with Chandra again and do it again, because that's going to do 4 damage, up to 6, 8, whatever it might be, however long she lives. Our opponents probably aren't going to make it out of that. But this is great for any other Planeswalkers we have, because if we combine this with Acolyte of Flame, she zeros to put a loyalty counter on each Planeswalker, so we can zero her, put loyalty counters on all of our Planeswalkers, activate all those Planeswalkers, activate Chain Veil, activate Acolyte of Flame again, put more loyalty counters on our Planeswalkers, probably putting some of them into ultimate range because they just pretty much +3'd that turn, and then ultimating some other Planeswalkers, or minusing or plussing, or whatever we might have to do. So Chain Veil is incredibly powerful in a Super Friends strategy, and I'm very happy that we were able to fit it into the budget. However, I do want to point out that one of the main reasons we were able to fit this in the budget, which we're talking $16, Chandra was $11, that's $27 worth of our budget right there. So if you cut those 2 cards, you're dropping down to about $70 for this deck, which is a lot more manageable. And that's also considering that we're including double digits worth of Planeswalkers in this deck. So there are a ton of red Planeswalkers that are incredibly cheap and are able to squeeze into a Super Friends deck. So if mono red Super Friends, or some form of Super Friends that includes red, is interesting to you, I would highly recommend picking up a lot of the Planeswalkers, because they are very cheap at the moment. Most of them floating between $2 to $5, which is not terrible for Planeswalkers, and there's actually quite a few that are less than $1 even, so definitely something to consider when we're looking at the fact that just cutting 2 cards from this deck drops us to $70. So if you want to trim off some prices, there are some ways to do that. However, if you would like to add a card to this deck to increase the price of it, I also have a suggestion for you there, and it is a Planeswalker. It is the only mono red Planeswalker that I did not include for budget purposes, and that one is Chandra Dressed to Kill, which is currently almost $19. So Chandra Dressed to Kill is 1 red for a 3 loyalty legendary Planeswalker Chandra, +1, add a red mana. Chandra Dressed to Kill deals 1 damage to up to 1 target player or Planeswalker, +1, exile the top card of your library. If it's red, you may cast it this turn. And -7, exile the top 5 cards of your library. You may cast red spells from among them this turn. You get an emblem with, whenever you cast a red spell, this emblem deals X damage to any target, where X is the amount of mana spent to cast that spell. So Chandra is incredibly powerful because it's card advantage, it's mana, it's damage, it's also just, if we can exile it, we get the emblem that does damage. So An incredibly powerful card, and honestly, when I first built this deck, she was actually in the deck and was only about $8 at the time. And then Pioneer really started to pick up, and she started to see a lot of play there. She started to see a lot more play in Standard. People kind of caught on to the fact that Dress to Kill is a very good card, and she shot up to about $19. So I did have to cut her from the final build of the deck, and I replaced her with Wall of Stone, which is just one red for a 0/8 wall. So essentially it has Defender. And the idea here was that if we can't have Chandra, then the next best thing would be to protect the rest of our planeswalkers. However, if you do have the budget for Chandra, I would highly recommend swapping them back, because while Wall of Stone is good, it's a 0/8 defender, which can stop pretty much everything, it's no Chandra Dress to Kill. And they are the same mana cost, which is one of the big reasons that I swapped them in the first place, but Chandra Dress to Kill is significantly better, but she is also significantly more expensive. That is the actual deck tech for this week, and I guess the last thing to do is to see how this deck actually performs in a game, because we've talked all about the synergies, we've talked about the themes and the goals, but it is important to see how the deck actually functions. So this week, we are going to run this deck up against 3 opponents. Jaya, Font of Hope, being played by Shawn, Sephrus of the Hidden Ways, being played by Bilal, and Hidetsugu Devouring Chaos, being played by AngryCow. So these 3 decks are all very different, and I think they all pose a very big threat to us in different ways. So first up, Jaya, Font of Hope, being an Angel tribal deck from Shawn. Like I mentioned earlier, we do have some defenders with reach. However, they don't all have reach. So flying is definitely a big weakness for us. And even the ones that do have reach, they're 0/3s and 0/4s. I would imagine most angels are going to be bigger than 0/3s and 0/4s. So I am a little worried that the angels are just going to kind of keep flying over our walls and knocking out our planeswalkers, and then we're not going to be able to do too much. Hopefully, that's not quite the case, but we'll see how that one goes. Next up, we have Bilal's Sephrus deck, which is equal parts mix of a dungeon deck, so he wants to venture, but also a reanimation style deck, because Sephrus wants to pull creatures out of the graveyard and wants creatures to go to the graveyard. So he wants to put big creatures into his graveyard early, reanimate them, venture into the dungeon, activate his commander, reanimate them again, and just kind of keep the value train going. So I would imagine there's going to be a lot of big creatures on his side of the board too, which means that they're not really going to crumble to burn spells and things like that. So ideally, we'll be able to kind of stave off some of his attacks with our defenders, make sure that he's not hitting our planeswalkers at the very least, and then kind of use emblems and burn to kind of put some inevitability on Bilal the player rather than the Sephrus deck itself, in the hopes that we'll be able to, do what the burn deck wants to do and just eliminate a player rather than eliminating creatures. And then finally, we have AngryCow's Hidetsugu Devouring Chaos deck, and I will say I think this one out of all of them probably scares me the most, because of Hidetsugu's second ability to exile the top card of his library, play that card this turn, but when you exile a non-land card this way, Hidetsugu deals damage equal to the exiled card's mana value to any target. That could be planeswalkers. So Cow really doesn't even have to worry about our defenders, because he can just throw cards at our planeswalkers' faces without ever having to attack. That means that our defender strategy is going to be a little bit rough when it comes to Hidetsugu. So I am very worried about what he's going to be doing. I'd imagine there's going to be a ton of very large spells, the split cards and things like that can do a ton of damage all at once. So I think out of everyone at the table, the Hidetsugu deck is the one that I am the most worried about, at least when it comes to our particular strategy. But I'm interested to see how this game goes. I don't think we match up super well against some of these decks, so I think this is our chance to kind of prove to the table that mono red can still do quite a bit of damage. So we'll see how it goes, but I hope you all enjoy the game. If you do, please do like the video, subscribe to the channel, but I will see you all when it's done, and we'll talk about how it goes. At the start of the game, I go first, followed by Shawn, Bilal, and AngryCow. On my first turn, I play a mountain. On Shawn's first turn, he plays a plains. Bilal plays a Temple of Silence, scrying 1. Cow plays a mountain and then casts Faithless Looting, drawing 2 cards and then discarding 2 cards. I play a mountain and cast Aether Flame Wall, which can get +1/+0 until end of turn for each red mana paid into it. Shawn plays a plains and casts his commander Jaya, Font of Hope, which can tap for a white mana and also allows Shawn's angels to enter with +1/+1 counters equal to the total number of other angels he controls. Bilal plays a swamp. Cow plays a swamp and casts Charcoal Diamond. I play a Forge of Heroes and cast Tuk Tuk Rubble Fort, giving all my creatures haste. Shawn plays a Plains and casts Folk Hero, allowing him to draw a card whenever he casts an angel, but only once per turn. He then attacks Cow for 2 with Jaya. Bilal plays a Plains and casts a Commander Sphere. Cow plays a swamp and casts his commander Hidetsugu Devouring Chaos. I play a mountain and cast Chandra Torch of Defiance. I then activate Chandra's -3 ability to do 4 damage to Hidetsugu, killing it. Shawn plays a Plains and casts Mirror Entity, coming in with a +1/+1 counter since it's an angel, and also allowing him to pay X mana to make all his creatures have base power and toughness XX until the end of turn. After that, he casts a Soul's Attendant, gaining Shawn a life whenever another creature enters the battlefield, and he moves to combat, attacking Bilal for 2 with Jaya. On Bilal's turn, he casts Baleful Strix, drawing a card, but still can't find another land drop. Cow plays a mountain and casts Scroll Rack, which can be activated to swap any number of cards in his hand with the same number of cards on top of his library. He follows that up by casting Sanguine Spy. I play a mountain and activate Chandra's +1 ability, exiling the top card of my library and being able to cast it, doing 2 damage to each opponent if I choose not to. This exiles the Chain Veil, which I cast, meaning I take 2 damage at the end of my turn if I haven't activated a Planeswalker, and can also be activated for 4 mana to let me activate all my Planeswalkers twice on a turn. Shawn plays a Plains and attacks Chandra with all of his creatures, and I choose not to block, killing the Planeswalker. Then, in his second main phase, he casts an Enduring Angel, giving himself hexproof, and it also enters with 2 +1/+1 counters and draws him a card. Bilal discards Radiant Solar, gaining 3 life and venturing into the dungeon of the Mad Mage, gaining another life. He then casts Persist, returning Radiant Solar to the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter. This also now allows Bilal to venture into the dungeon whenever a non-token creature enters under his control, doing so when the Solar enters and scrying 1. Cow plays a mountain, and then attacks Shawn for 2 with the Spy since it has Menace, and gains 2 life since it also has lifelink. Then, in his second main phase, he recasts his commander Hidetsugu. I play a mountain and cast Commander Sphere, and then cast my commander Chandra Fire of Kaladesh, which can tap to do 1 damage to a player, untap if I cast a red spell, and transform if she's dealt 3 damage to an opponent in 1 turn. Shawn plays a Temple of the False Gods, and attacks Bilal with Mirror Entity, me with Jaya, and Cow with Enduring Angel. Bilal blocks the entity with Baleful Strix, killing both creatures, while Cow and I choose not to block, so I take 2 from Jaya and Cow takes 6. Then in Shawn's second main phase, he casts Karmic Guide, which comes in with 2 counters, returning Mirror Entity from the graveyard to the battlefield, which comes in with 3 counters, and also draws a card. On Bilal's turn, he plays an Irrigated Farmland, and then casts his commander Sephris of the Hidden Ways, allowing him to venture into the dungeon whenever a creature he controls goes to the graveyard, but only once a turn. It also allows him to return a creature from his graveyard to the battlefield when he completes a dungeon. Finally, this also triggers the Solar, venturing into the dungeon and making a treasure token. Cow casts a Hedron Archive, and then activates Hidetsugu, exiling the top card of his library, doing damage equal to its mana value to any target, and being able to play that card this turn. This exiles a mountain, which he plays for the turn. He then moves to combat, attacking me for 2, and I block with both of my walls, taking no damage, while Cow gains 2 life with lifelink. Then at the end of turn, I tap Chandra to do 1 damage to Bilal. On my turn, I play a mountain, and tap Chandra, doing 1 damage to Bilal, and follow that up by casting Brimstone Trebuchet, which can tap to do 1 damage to each opponent, and untaps when I cast a knight. This triggers Chandra, untapping her, and I immediately tap her again to do another damage to Bilal. Then I cast a Pyroblast, destroying Sephrus, letting Bilal venture, scry 2, and untapping Chandra again. This allows me to tap Chandra a 3rd time, doing 1 damage to Cow. However, before the ability resolves, Shawn casts Path to Exile to attempt to exile Chandra. Luckily, I have the answer, casting Reverberate to copy Path to Exile, exiling Shawn's Enduring Angel instead. This untaps Chandra and allows me to tap her to finally do a damage to Shawn, this time transforming her into Chandra Roaring Flame, fizzling Shawn's original Path to Exile. Once she transforms, I activate Chandra's +1 ability, doing 2 damage to Shawn. Finally, I activate Forge of Heroes, putting an extra loyalty counter on my commander since she technically entered the battlefield this turn. In Shawn's upkeep, he pays the Echo cost for Karmic Guide, keeping it around, then plays a Plains, and casts Serra Avenger, coming in with 3 +1/+1 counters and drawing a card. On Bilal's turn, he evokes a Revelark, venturing into the dungeon when it enters, creating 2 skeleton tokens, and also dying immediately due to being revoked, returning Sephrus and Baleful Strix to play, which has him venturing 3 more times, drawing a card, scrying 3, and then drawing 3 cards, revealing them and being able to cast one of them for free. This has him casting Sire of Stagnation, venturing again. Then, since he completed a dungeon, Sephrus triggers and returns Revelark from the graveyard to the battlefield, venturing again. With that, he restarts the Dungeon of the Mad Mage, gaining a life, scrying 1, and preventing Serra Avenger from attacking next turn. He also plays an Orzhov Basilica, returning a Plains to his hand, and, at the end of turn, Cow activates Scroll Rack, exchanging out 2 cards. On Cow's turn, he casts Glittering Stockpile, and then casts Volcanic Vision, returning In Garrick's Wake from his graveyard to his hand and doing 9 damage to each creature he doesn't control. In response, I tap Brimstone Trebuchet to do 1 damage to each opponent, then everything dies, triggering Bilal's Sephrus and Revelark, venturing into the dungeon, scrying 2, returning Sephrus and Baleful Strix to play, drawing a card. Then Cow moves to combat, attacking Chandra for 6, gaining 2 life and killing my commander. On my turn, I cast a Magus of the Wheel and recast my commander, Chandra, Fire of Kaladesh. Then, at the end of turn, I take 2 damage from the Chain Veil. Shawn casts an Endless Atlas, which can be activated to draw a card, and then also casts Valkyrie Harbinger, which creates a 4/4 angel in his end step as long as he's gained 4 or more life this turn. Bilal plays a Plains and casts Animate Dead, returning Radiant Solar to play from the graveyard, venturing into the dungeon and creating 2 skeleton tokens. After that, he casts a Plague Crafter, making each player sacrifice a creature. This kills Chandra, Valkyrie Harbinger, Plague Crafter, and Sanguine Spy. It also allows Bilal to venture when it enters, and also when it leaves, letting him scry 3, then draw 3 cards, revealing a Serra's Emissary and casting it for free, naming creatures to give himself and his creatures protection from creatures, and venturing again, restarting the Dungeon of the Mad Mage, gaining a life. After that, he casts a Lightning Greaves, immediately equipping them to Serra's Emissary, giving it Shroud and Haste. At this point, we realize he completed a dungeon, so his commander triggers, returning Consecrated Sphinx to play from the graveyard, allowing Bilal to draw 2 cards whenever his opponents draw 1, venturing yet again and scrying 1. He moves to combat, attacking Shawn for 10 total damage with the Emissary, Sephrus, and Baleful Strix. When Cow draws for turn, Bilal draws 2 as well, and then Cow casts in Garruk's Wake, destroying all creatures and planeswalkers he doesn't control. This triggers Bilal's commander, venturing, making him a treasure token, but does succeed in wiping the board, allowing Cow to attack Bilal for 4 with Hidetsugu. On my turn, I cast Chandra Pyromaster, activating Chandra's 0 ability to exile the top card of my library and allowing me to play it until the end of turn. This exiles Carol Keep Disciples, which I cast, and it does 1 damage to each opponent whenever I activate the loyalty ability of a Chandra Planeswalker. Shawn plays a Plains and recasts his commander Jaya. After that, he casts a Youthful Valkyrie, which enters with a +1/+1 counter and gets another +1/+1 counter whenever Shawn casts an Angel. This also triggers Folk Hero, drawing him a card, and he activates Endless Atlas, drawing yet another card. Bilal plays a Prairie Stream and recasts his commander Sephrus, followed up by casting Teferi, Master of Time. He activates Teferi's +1 ability to draw a card and discard a card, and this has him discarding a creature, triggering Sephrus, venturing into the dungeon, and scrying 2. At the end of turn, Cow activates his Scroll Rack, exchanging 3 cards. On Cow's turn, he plays a Luxury Suite and casts Gratuitous Violence, doubling all damage dealt by his creatures. He then activates Hidetsugu, exiling Calibrated Blast and doing 6 total damage to Bilal. He casts the Calibrated Blast, revealing cards from the top of his library until he reveals a non-land card, doing damage to any target equal to its mana value, then putting all revealed cards on the bottom of his library. This has him revealing Heartless Hidetsugu, doing 5 damage to Teferi, killing the Planeswalker. On my turn, I activate Chandra's 0 ability, doing 1 damage to each opponent and exiling Cathartic Reunion from my library, but I can't cast it since I can't discard 2 cards, having only 1 in hand. I do though cast Koth of the Hammer, and activate Koth's +1 ability to untap a mountain and turn it into an 8/8 creature until the end of turn. After that, I activate the Chain Veil, letting me activate all my Planeswalkers again this turn, and I, again, use Chandra's 0 ability, doing 1 damage to each opponent, exiling a mountain, which I play for the turn, and finally, I activate Koth's +1 ability to turn another mountain into a 4/4, untapping it and passing, since I forget that they're only creatures until the end of my turn. Shawn casts an Emeria Angel, which comes in with 2 +1/+1 counters, puts a +1/+1 counter on Youthful Valkyrie, draws Shawn a card, and allows him to make a 1/1 bird token whenever he plays a land, which he immediately does, playing a Plains, making a bird. He then casts Elspeth Conquers Death, which exiles Gratuitous Violence when it comes into play, and attacks Koth with the Valkyrie and Jaya. Before the damage, I sacrifice Commander Sphere, hoping to find an answer, but unfortunately I don't, so Koth is killed. At the end of Shawn's turn, he activates Endless Atlas to draw a card. Bilal plays a Plains and casts Sepulchral Primordial, putting a creature into play from each opponent's graveyard. This has him putting Sanguine Spy, Tuk Rebel Fort, and Soul's Attendant into play, gaining 2 life. He then moves to combat, attacking Chandra with the Primordial, since it has haste thanks to Tuk Rebel Fort, killing the Planeswalker. Cow activates Hidetsugu on his turn, exiling Volcanic Salvo, doing 12 damage to Bilal but not casting it. He then flashes back Faithless Looting, drawing 2 cards and discarding 2 cards. On my turn, I play a Mountain and recast my commander, Chandra Fire of Kaladesh, and activate Forge of Heroes, putting a +1/+1 counter on her. Then I pass, taking 2 damage from Chain Veil. In Shawn's draw step, his Saga triggers, making all non-creature spells his opponents cast cost 2 more to cast until his next turn. In response, Cow flashes back Calibrated Blast, revealing Involuntary Employment, doing 4 damage to Soul's Attendant, killing it, and letting Bilal venture into the dungeon, creating 2 skeleton tokens. Unfortunately, this wouldn't have happened since the attendant didn't go to Bilal's graveyard, but we don't catch that at the time. Shawn then plays a Path of Ancestry, creating a bird token, and then casts and immediately sacrifices Wayfarer's Bauble to search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped, making another bird token. He also activates Endless Atlas to draw a card, and then moves to combat, attacking me for 2 with Jaya, Cow for 1 with a bird, and Bilal with everything else for 8 total damage. In his second main phase, he casts a Court of Grace, becoming the Monarch and creating a 1/1 Spirit token in his upkeep, or creating a 4/4 Angel token if he's the Monarch. Then he draws a card at the end of turn, since he is currently the Monarch. In Bilal's upkeep, he uses Sanguine Spy to sacrifice the skeleton, looking at and putting the top card of his library into his graveyard, venturing into the dungeon and scrying 3. Then in his main phase, he casts Yawgmoth's Vile Offering, destroying Emeria Angel and putting Radiant Solar into play from his graveyard, venturing again, drawing 3 cards, and casting Ingenious Mastery from among them for free, letting him draw 3 cards, while I create 2 treasure tokens and scry 2. Since he completed a dungeon, this triggers Sephris, allowing him to return Serra's Emissary from his graveyard to play, again giving himself and his creatures protection from creatures, and venturing again, gaining a life. He then equips the Lightning Greaves to Serra's Emissary, giving it haste and shroud, and then plays a Sunken Hollow and moves to combat, attacking Cow for a total of 20 damage with all of his creatures, which are all unblockable thanks to protection from creatures, gaining 2 life with lifelink. On Cow's turn, he activates Scroll Rack, exchanging 1 card, and then casts Erratic Explosion, revealing cards from the top of his library until he reveals a non-land card, doing damage to any target equal to its mana value. This has him hitting Dead Drop and doing 10 damage to Bilal. On my turn, I cast Mana Geyser, making a total of 22 red mana since my opponents control 22 tapped lands. With the trigger to untap Chandra on the stack, I tap her to do 1 damage to Shawn, and then untap her. I cast Chandra Heart of Fire, and activate Chandra's Heart of Fire's +1 ability, doing 1 damage to each opponent, discarding my hand, and exiling the top 3 cards of my library, being able to play them this turn. This hits Red Elemental Blast, Chandra Awakened Inferno, and Fire Diamond. I cast the Chandra Awakened Inferno, again tapping my commander to do 1 damage to Shawn in response and untapping her. I then activate Awakened Inferno's +2 ability, doing 1 damage to each opponent, and also giving each opponent an emblem that does 1 damage to them in their upkeep. After that, I activate the Chain Veil, allowing me to activate all my Planeswalkers again. This lets me use Awakened Inferno's +2 ability, doing 1 damage to each opponent and giving them all another emblem. I also activate Heart of Fire's +1 ability, doing 1 damage to each opponent, and again discarding my hand and exiling 3 cards from my library, hitting 2 mountains and an Abrade. After that, I tap Chandra to do 1 damage to Shawn, transforming my commander. Finally, I cast Abrade to destroy Bilal's Lightning Greaves, but in response, Bilal sacrifices Commander Sphere to draw a card, but since he doesn't find an answer, the Abrade resolves, and he sacrifices a skeleton to look at the top card of his library, putting it into the graveyard, venturing into the dungeon, scrying 1, and then his Greaves are destroyed. Finally, I activate Roaring Flames +1 ability to do 2 damage to Shawn and 1 damage to each opponent before passing. In Shawn's upkeep, he takes 2 damage from the emblems and creates a 4/4 Angel token. Then, Elspeth Conquers Death triggers, returning Karmic Guide to play with a +1/+1 counter on it, which also returns Mirror Entity to play. He then plays a Plains, and attacks me with his 5 flying creatures, which I can't block. Before damage though, he activates Mirror Entity for 6, making all of his creatures into 6/6s, hitting me for 33 total damage, knocking me out of the game. In his second main phase, he activates Endless Atlas to draw a card, and then casts an Angel of Finality, drawing a card, putting 5 +1/+1 counters on it, 1 +1/+1 counter on the Valkyrie, and exiling Bilal's graveyard. He also casts a Sephara Sky's Blade, giving all his other flying creatures indestructible, and in response, Cow activates Hidetsugu, exiling Curtain's Call and doing 6 damage to Bilal, but Bilal's protection from creatures saves him. But this does let Cow cast the Curtain's Call to destroy Sarah's Emissary and Mirror Entity. However, in response, Shawn casts Sajiri's Shelter to give Mirror Entity protection from black until the end of turn, saving his creature. Then Shawn passes and draws a card at the end of turn for being the Monarch. In Bilal's upkeep, he takes 2 damage from Chandra's emblems, and then plays a command tower and casts Razaketh the Foul-Blooded, venturing into the dungeon, creating a treasure token. He moves to combat, attacking Cow for 2 with his own Sanguine Spy, gaining 2 life. This allows him to pay 2 life and sacrifice the Spy to Razaketh, searching his library for a card and putting it into his hand. Then he casts the card he searched for, Necromancy, using it to return Sarah's Emissary to play, again giving himself protection from creatures, venturing and scrying 2. In Cow's upkeep, he takes 2 damage from Chandra's emblems, and then casts Ancient Craving, drawing 3 cards and losing 3 life. He also casts a Soul Ring, followed up by an Apex of Power, exiling the top 7 cards of his library, being able to cast them this turn, and also creating 10 red mana. After that, he activates Hidetsugu, exiling Insult to Injury, doing 6 damage to Shawn. After that, he casts the Insult, doubling all damage he does this turn. Finally, he casts Toil and Trouble, fused, to make Shawn take 4 damage, draw 2 cards, and lose 2 life. Unfortunately though, that's all Cow can do, so Shawn is able to untap on his turn, attack Cow for lethal damage, and then pass the turn so that Bilal dies in his upkeep to Chandra's emblems, winning Shawn the game. Alright, so that was a super sweet game. We unfortunately didn't do too much in the early game. I was very much right about our planeswalkers that kept getting attacked by flyers or kept getting shot down by things like Hidetsugu. So we didn't do too much in the early game, but we did have a super sweet turn right near the end where we were able to get down Awakened Inferno, we were able to get down the Chain Veil, we were able to activate multiple planeswalkers during a turn, do a ton of damage, draw a ton of cards. It was super sweet to watch the deck go off like that. Granted, it was all on the back of Mana Geyser, which is an incredibly powerful spell, so there is proof that the deck can do very powerful things, and I think that had we had one more turn, we very much could have done even more powerful things, but it wasn't quite in the cards. Shawn's deck, the Angels, also very powerful. I think the fact that Jaya puts counters on the Angels when they come in just really put them out of kill range for most of our stuff. And at one point, Bilal mentioned that I could have used Awakened Inferno to wipe Shawn's board, but Awakened Inferno only does 3 damage to each creature, and the only Angel on Shawn's board that had 3 toughness or less was actually Jaya, so he really escaped a lot of our board wipes in that game, because Red doesn't have hard removal. We have Blasphemous Act, which does 13 damage, but that's about it. Most of our other stuff does 3 to 4 to 5 damage to each creature, and a lot of his Angels would have survived that. So very impressive showing by the Angels, and I think that they did a very good job of kind of keeping things big with Mirror Entity, and also Shawn did a great job of showing the reanimation capabilities of Angels with Karmic Guide and things like that. So very impressive, and a very well-deserved win. And then Bilal's Sephiroth deck, also very good. I'll be honest, editing this video was kind of a pain because of all the Sephiroth triggers. There were just so many times when he ventured into the dungeon and reanimated creatures and killed creatures, and it was a super sweet deck to watch go off, but it was definitely a deck that you gotta keep an eye on because it can kind of come from nowhere and just do everything it wants to do really quickly and really suddenly and very, very powerful. So a very impressive showing there as well. And then finally, Cow, also a very impressive showing as always. The Hidetsugu deck was super sweet to watch, and it was very interesting to see all of the super expensive cards that had abilities like Undaunted or were split cards, so that he was still able to actually cast them if he needed to. It wasn't just running a ton of expensive cards for no real reason, like you might sometimes see in a AngryCow style deck, for example. But I think overall it was very good, and Hidetsugu really put a lot of pressure on the table because we never knew when he was going to flip, a 13 mana spell off the top of the deck and just hit one of us for 13 or kill our biggest creature. So very, very cool to see. And he almost was able to close out the victory at the end, but didn't quite get there. He was a couple mana short from being able to cast Explosive Singularity and actually killing Shawn and then letting Bilal die to the Chandra emblems. So super, super sweet game. Very happy with how this deck turned out. If you are interested in any future decks for this channel, like I said earlier, please do like the video, subscribe, and if you have any suggestions for future cards that you would like to see, I'm always happy to take suggestions. You can put them in the comments, you can send them to me on Twitter, send them to me on Reddit, you can send them to me by email, you can sign up for our Patreon and send them to me there. Doesn't really matter. Wherever you send me those suggestions, I will do my best to take them into account and try to get them into a video. But I will be honest, I do have a ton of suggestions that have come in, so if you do suggest a card for the channel, it will probably be a little while before it does be made into a video, but my goal is to make it into a video eventually. So thank you everybody for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.